recording a little earlier than usual. It's not as cold tonight, so I can leave my heat off for my video. I just recorded another video that you guys won't see for several months. Well, okay, not several months, but several weeks. So this chapter, chapter 17, is an interesting chapter for me because I've actually been to this place. So I want to start off this chapter by telling you my story. So, my father and I, we were living out on a farm a few years back, and he got a call to pick up a calf, a little cow in Lebanon, I'd like to say, but I'm not 100% sure. I went with him. We just had a little SUV at the time, which we stuck our cow in the back seat of, or not the back seat of, the trunk of, because it was open back there. She was about the size of a large dog. She looked like a little deer. She was a brown Swiss cow. But we passed by, going up there, a sign that said, Windyville, next. I think it was next or right. And I'm like, Dad, I read about this place in my ghost book. And Dad goes, oh yeah? I go, yeah. And like, I can't, remember too much about it. And I've read through this book a few times now. And he says he had an appointment with the guy to get the cow. He says, well, after we get the cow, we'll drive through it. Obviously, we couldn't get out because we had a cow in the car, but we did get to see a lot of the places mentioned. We did see a very strange man who, because we went down a dead-end road, and he was walking in kind of like the ditch of an open field. There's nowhere for him to go, and when we turned back around at the dead end, he was gone. It was eerie. Thinking back now, I wish I would have gone into the canning factory that you'll hear about in this chapter. So if you guys have any questions about that, let me know. So, Chapter 7, The Ghosts of Windyville. Highway K strays from State Road 64 south 4 miles to Windyville, Missouri, where it unexpectedly enters the small Ozark town, then crosses the Niagara River a mile or so on. It turns westward between 4 Mile Creek and the river into the hills of forest and deep hollows, and emerges at last to Highway 32. In late spring and summer, Black-Eyed Susan and Queen Anne's sleighs crowd the roadside, nodding to those who pass, and like dream catchers, spider webs glisten between strands of rusty barbed wire fence. Only a small road sign, obscured somewhat by cedar boughs, marks the north boundary of Windyville, allowing just seconds to glimpse the village as one passes through. It's true. The road rushes between two old store buildings, fronted by the Moon Valley Road and Highway M. The smallest building is vacant, its weathered front faded, draped with vine and shadowed in the canopy of a huge elm. Across from it stands the Windyville General Store, a large stately structure with a high false front where faced letters proclaim its beginning in 1921. The spacious old store has changed little in its 75 years. Only its owners have changed. A short distance behind the store is an old tomato canning factory, a relic of the Depression era. A rusty tin roof, loose in many places, covers most of the weary structure. It is isolated, windowless, and holds many secrets within its perpetual darkness. A post office and small antique store are located approximately 50 feet east of the store. 7 dwellings and a community building complete the crossroad town. Most people who pass through Windyville would never guess what bizarre occurrences have plagued the town and the surrounding area over the years. Much of it has become legend, passed down, often reluctantly, by descendants of those who experienced the frightful happenings. But time has not erased their memory. Some people scoff at the idea that the supernatural often comes at night to haunt the innocent. Others are skeptical, but all are ill at ease, uncertain of their convictions. It has been speculated that desecrated graves of Osage Indians, numerous in and around Winnieville, are in part the cause of many mysterious happenings. Like the other native tribes, the Osage Indians of the Niangua River Basin had sacred rituals, ceremonies, and customs which demonstrated their sincere belief in a supreme being, a hereafter, and also in evil spirits. As exiles from their ancestral land, Osage people were forbidden to return to the burial sites to pay homage to their culture. Homage as their culture demanded. The burial of their dead has been defiled countless times over, and skeletal remains sometimes appear in this area in plowed fields, hog yards, and cattle lots. It is not just the Osages who believe that the spot where a person is laid to rest never forgets that the person in some ways is still there and can actually partake in a living being's spirit and breathe. Some Winnieville stories. A mile or so south of town, there once stood a house besieged by unexplained events. In and around it, rocks were said to fall suddenly from the ceiling or from trees outside. Many claimed to have witnessed the phenomenon. Before this, the owner of the house disappeared without a trace, and it was believed that his wife and her lover killed him and hid his body in a cave on the Niangua. That might be the guy we saw, because it was about there when we turned around. In a house in the center of Winnieville, across from the general store, a young boy was badly frightened by a loud wailing in a second-story room. His parents told him that it was only his imagination, but later one night it came again. The boy's father learned that an old man had passed away in the room several years before, after suffering dreadfully from mysterious illness. A few years later, the father himself, while standing on the back porch one night, felt a heavy hand come to rest on his shoulder. When he turned to see who it was, nobody was there. In 1994, after a local woman's untimely death, her ghost-like image appeared briefly in the house. She was the picture of youth again, clear of skin, with flowing raven hair hanging to her hips, and she wore a long orange dress. The old canning factory has not been spared in the haunting of Winnieville, for there have been claims of frightful screams and loud pounding on its shadowy interior. Once, a man repairing a nearby fence decided to take a look inside the building. A door that had long since given up its hinges stood partly ajar near the north end of the building. He carefully picked it up and placed it against a tree. Inside, the only light was from a waning sun, streaming through cracks in the walls. Littering the floor were empty tomato crates and brown glass jugs. Dust lay heavy over all the debris, but not a track of animal or humans was evident anywhere. Above him, the explorer could see a loft, half the width of the building. At one end, a ladder ascended to the darkness above. Still at ease and curious, he started up but stopped abruptly when he heard what sounded like shuffling footsteps overhead. It sounded, the man said, as if someone were trying to creep towards the edge of the loft. Not one to frighten easily, he scrambled up the ladder and peered around, expecting to confront somebody or some creature. Light was poor, the man continued, but I could see the entire length and breadth of the loft, and nothing was there, not even a track to mar the dust on the floor. I guess I lost it then, he laughed, for I flung myself down the ladder and ran for the doorway, but when I got there, I found the door had been placed against the opening. I tell you one thing for sure, I didn't waste any time busting through to the outside, and I've not been back since. One Sunday morning, 2 people observed a small tin bucket hanging on a peg in the front display room of the antique store, banging violently against the wall. It continued its erratic movement for nearly 5 minutes. Several times, heavy footsteps had been heard in the attic above the store, along with its scraping sounds of something being moved. An aged woman living in a house next door to the store reported that she several times was visited by small children, unfamiliar to her in this small town where everyone knows everyone. The children never uttered a word, but ran about pifling through her belongings. One night, she said, she saw a group of men killing another on the front lawn, and for many nights afterwards she claimed she saw them hiding behind trees, watching the house. Most people considered her demented. In the spring of 1992, another woman of senior years was sitting in a chair in her front lawn, directly behind the antique store, drinking a cup of coffee. She said a bluebird began singing in a tree above her. Delighted by the sweet sound, she listened, but said at first the sound was that of a bird, but then there were words. It was a sad song of a lost love, and I wept. A stranger wandered into town one morning in the spring of 1993. Weary and haggard from a chilly night lost in the woods, he claimed to have no idea of where he was and wanted only to return home to Springfield. He said that he had spent the night huddled beneath a huge oak tree and that demons leaped from the trees and danced around him. They taunted me, he said, and they stank like no creature I have ever known. When I asked if he had been drinking, the young man looked at me straight in the eyes and replied, "No, sir, I am a Christian. You must believe me. May God have mercy on all of you, for those creatures are everywhere." Another stranger passing through Windyville in the late summer of 1993 said the town was disturbingly full of spirits. When asked how he knew, he said, "There is an unearthly coldness here, and I can feel them." That is true. A child walking with a parent along the south road that leads out of Windyville suddenly burst into a fit of tears, pointed at a vacant house near the side of the road and cried, "There are ghosts in there." The house the little girl had so tearfully referred to has suffered the most. Occurrences there have struck terror in many of its occupants and sent them fleeing. Footsteps on the stairs in the middle of the night finally entered a bedroom to reveal a ghost of a man who once resided in the house. Spiders by the thousands suddenly invaded the house, only to disappear and be replaced by an equal number of cockroaches. Strange, pale faces appear at the windows, and footsteps hurry away, leaving no tracks. The ghost of the man who once lived in the house has also been reported seen in front of the store in broad daylight, once entering a closed window. For a while, the house was vacant, and sometimes in the evening about dusk, a curtain would flutter part way open in a second-story window. It has also been reported that a coldness often settled in around the house in late evening and would chill the bones of anyone who ventured too close. Once a stench emitted from the house. Neighbors likened it to rotten flesh, and the same smell was said to have come just a few days after his death from the grave of a man who once lived in the house. In the spring of 1994, all the birds in a portion of Windyville disappeared and did not return until the autumn of the same year. Not even a sparrow could be seen, yet a few hundred feet outside the affected area, birds flourished. Sometime in the year of 1934, two young women walked along a road near the Lone Creek Cemetery, a couple of miles west of Windyville. Said a cold burst of wind suddenly swept out of the graveyard, scattering leaves and other debris across the road where they stood. Seconds later, a horse and rider rose up from near the center of the cemetery to approximately 50 feet above and hovered there, motionless for a few seconds. The rider raised an arm and appeared to be shouting. As quickly as it had appeared, the image had vanished. Sightings of this horse and rider had been claimed for several years prior to that of the young woman. Nobody seems to know why. No sighting has been reported since. As promised, I have identified no one who revealed to me their stories of ghosts, spirits, or otherwise unexplainable events in and around Windyville. Many scoff and say there is no truth at all. There are many who believe. Windyville is no longer on most road maps. It is between Buffalo and Bennett Springs. Powell says the usual name is believed to have been chosen for its descriptiveness. The town is on top of a second or third highest point in Dallas County. Now for some other haunted places. The Haunted Smithy. Jim Longo and his two fascinating collections of ghost stories in our state in Illinois, Haunted Odyssey and Ghosts Along the Mississippi, offer several that are more than unique. One concerns a haunted blacksmith shop. Longo tells us that his subject described buying property in the Femme Osage Valley, the area where Daniel Boone and his son Nathan and other family members had settled. This land included some log buildings from the Boone era, never used by anyone but the builder and his descendants. Among these was a smithy, a necessity for most pioneers, because living so far from town, they usually were on their own for horseshoeing and implement repair. Longo's source, whom we'll call Carl for convenience, said that when he was younger, he traveled quite a lot because his own neighborhood didn't provide enough customers to support his family. One night, when he came home, his wife told him the anvil had been ringing all day, as if he were at work. The story does not specify if she asked whether he'd given someone else permission to use his equipment, or if they both feared someone was just confiscating it. Those would seem to be the logical first thoughts, yet the wife must have gone out to see what was going on and become uneasy when she found the smithy empty. As time passed, the Pharaoh said he began to see movement in the smithy, and equipment seemed bewitched. Tools and finished work constantly fell from wall hangers that had always previously held them securely. Tools were frequently moved from the logical storage spot somewhere less convenient. One day, however, when he had a lot of work to get out and the ghostly impediments were especially bad, Carl lost his temper and shouted, "Why don't you leave me alone?" Promptly, with a heavy ox bow yoke fell off the well-supported place in the rafter, an object heavy enough to give fatal head injury. Carl then shouted with an even more wrath, challenging the entity to give him a little help sometimes. Amazingly, from that point, Carl said he not only had fewer problems, he seemed to be helped in dealing with usual demands of his work. When asked to do something new and difficult, a skillful ally seemed to be advising him. Carl decided he was host to the ghost of a blacksmith or farrier, and he concluded, whatever it wasn't scary. Carl was far from being the first person to decide that a discarnate companion was friendly, thus making it possible to take all manifestations in stride. The Haunted Goldenrod. At least 2 separate sets of ghosts are attributed to the Goldenrod showboat, which is docked at St. Charles and serves as a dinner theater. Those who write about the ghost aboard usually focus on a young woman named Victoria, drawn to her romantic story. The apparent basics on Victoria. She grew up on the Goldenrod, daughter of a widower captain. He was a totally indulgent father, except on one score. He would not tolerate Victoria's dream of becoming one of the boat's dancers. They had a major quarrel over the issue, and she flounced off into the night. Next day, her body was found floating in the river, wearing a garish red dress nobody had ever seen her in before. Superstition was that she'd found a job dancing in a cheap place, where she met misfortune. The devastated father died not long after, and the Goldenrod staff began seeing a lady in red, whom they at first supposed was a real person. Sometimes she appeared in photos taken by guests, or the boat's publicity people, and thus the idea of a ghost on the Goldenrod was born. A high school girl named Veronica Villarreal, who had worked on the Goldenrod as a hostess, confirmed to Longo that strange things did happen here. They were mainly the routine haunted places events, unexplainable sounds, objects disappearing, and lights turning themselves on. Veronica's own most unsettling experience came on an evening when she went aboard to pick something up. And at that time of night, lights should have been on, and the public address system busy with music and with communications from one part of the boat to another. Instead, all was silent, and she found herself alone. Understandably, Veronica hurried through her duties, one of which involved visiting the office. It was too empty and silent. She scuttled off as soon as she could, and when she had reached the shore, saw lights come on and music begin, full force. Someone was aboard after all. Next day, when she mentioned the experience to her bosses, they looked at her strangely and said they had all been there in their usual places, doing their usual work, the whole time. Veronica directed Longo to another former employee, who said that everyone learned to respect Victoria's spirit after an incident in the galley. A cook, having a bad day, blamed it on the ship's close quarters, cursing the Goldenrod. To his surprise, the equipment and the culinary creation he had worked hard on flew across the room to destruction. This may have inspired the idea that Victoria loved and protected the Goldenrod. Certainly something did, for it survived an era when the average lifespan of a riverboat, according to Robbie Cordaway's sources for her book Spirits of St. Louis, was about 5 years, considering all the dangers from its own steam, from floods, storms, snags, and fire. Veronica's theory is that Victoria found it easy to live on the Goldenrod because it kept as it looked in the era of her fleshly tenure there. People who have lived with congenial ghosts often tell researchers that on leaving the haunted era, they feel compelled to bid the entity goodbye. The floor manager Veronica introduced Longo to told him she chose to say goodbye in the banquet room, one of the most beautiful parts of the Goldenrod, and the place where she felt Victoria might be most likely to hear her. Missouri Life and other Missouri publications have explored the Goldenrod exhaustively. Troy Taylor, who publishes Ghost of the Prairie magazine and runs a large bookstore of supernatural materials, spent time on the Goldenrod making a film for the Education Channel. I heard the pastor's words again. When the body wears away, like a car and can't go on, the soul gets out and walks ahead until it finds its home. B. Kuckelman, from her poem Bonnie. that's the end of chapter 7.